When you think of some of the busiest train stations in the New York City subway, you would probably say Grand Central 42nd Street, 34th Street Penn Station, or the focus of this video, Times Square 42nd Street. If you transferred at this station to get to another train, or to transfer between its two neighboring stations, 42nd Street Port Authority Bus Terminal and 42nd Street Bryant Park, then you would have some sense of how unbelievably long, complicated, and congested that journey can be. Well, obviously, this station serves various subway lines that used to be part of separate companies. In this video, I hope to give you an explanation on how this station got to the labyrinth it is today, and some secrets as well. The first subway line to open a station at Times Square was of course constructed by the IRT, and it opened on October 27, 1904. Times Square 42nd Street was one of those original 28 stops, located on the east-west segment that runs under 42nd Street. This original station is actually the one that the shuttle train uses. By 1908, this original line ran north to Van Cortlandt Park, on what is now the 7th Avenue line, and also to 145th Street on what is now the Lenox Avenue line. Now, the opening of the New York City subway of course attracted a lot of people, and, at the time, the platforms at the stations only accommodated 5 cars. This led to overcrowding on those platforms. So in 1909, the New York Public Service Commission proposed lengthening those platforms. In the initial IRT contracts, express platforms would now accommodate 10 cars, and local trains would now accommodate 6 cars. Times Square Station was a local stop, which is why today the 42nd Street shuttle is 6 cars long. The platforms were lengthened from 20 to 30 feet, increasing capacity by 25%. Now back in the day, the layout used to only have 2 side platforms, one northbound and the other southbound. The northbound platform was extended on both ends, while the southbound platform was only extended south, which garnered an entrance from there to the Knickerbocker Hotel. It's now March of 1913, and a very important infrastructure scheme has just been officially signed between the city and the BRT and the IRT, the dual contracts. I've made a 2-part mini-series on this topic, and if you watched it, then you would know that the contracts would reconfigure the original subway. It would be split up into 3 segments, with the western portion becoming the 7th Avenue line, and the eastern portion becoming the Lexington Avenue line. The center portion that runs under 42nd Street will become a shuttle service, which Times Square 42nd Street station was on. New platforms will be built for the 7th Avenue line, while the shuttle platforms will be reconstructed. This involved the removal of Track 2, and the addition of a middle platform to serve Track 3. This became the former platform layout at the station before the renovation. On June 3, 1917, the 7th Avenue line platforms opened, with a transfer connection being opened between that line and the shuttle in the same year. The platforms on the 7th Ave would become an express stop, with the line continuing further south down Manhattan. Now, the dual contract was also in agreement with the BRT as well. They would also have a station that opened at Times Square 42nd Street. On January 5, 1918, the Broadway line opened an express stop to the east side of the 7th Avenue line platforms. Since the IRT and the BRT were rival companies, they wouldn't have a transfer connection between the 2 stations until much later. Next is the IRT's Flushing line, which initially opened between Grand Central 42nd Street and Queens using the Steinway Tunnel. In July of 1920, the New York State Public Commission announced a westward extension of the line to Times Square with an intermediate station at Bryant Park. The Flushing line platforms would be located under the other IRT platforms, with a series of passageways connecting them. You can start to see when the station became the maze that we are familiar with today. On March 14, 1927, the line was extended to Times Square, with connections to the shuttle and the 7th Avenue line opening as well. Now, this station was the site of a train wreck that killed 16 people. On August 24, 1928, at 5:09 p.m., an express train on the 7th Avenue line derailed right after leaving the platforms at Times Square. The last 2 cars suddenly switched track, causing 1 car to hit a pillar and a few more to turn over. Along with the 16 people that were killed, about 100 more were injured. This accident is the second deadliest in the New York City subway, with the first being the Malbone Street wreck. Now, there was yet another line that opened in close proximity to Times Square 42nd Street, 42nd Street Port Authority Bus Terminal. On September 10, 1932, this station opened on the 8th Avenue line of the city-owned independent subway system. On Christmas Eve of that year, a 600-foot-long passageway was constructed to Times Square 42nd Street. This is the infamous and tiresome transfer journey that all New Yorkers talk about. Anyways, 42nd Street Port Authority Bus Terminal actually had constructed a lower level with a side platform and track. However, this was eventually abandoned, but there are still some remnants, which I will get to later. June 1st, 1940 marked the day that the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit Company ceased to exist, as it handed over everything to the city of New York. The last BMT train ran from 57th Street 7th Avenue to Times Square 42nd Street, where about 500 people were waiting. Then, on June 12th, the city took over the IRT, which now meant that all the subway lines that served stations on 42nd Street were now controlled by New York City. This further unified the lines from a company standpoint, along with the physical transfer connections. The amalgamation of the BMT and the IRT into one system allowed for transfers between the once rival companies. So, at Times Square, a free transfer was implemented between the IRT platforms and the Broadway line platforms on July 1st, 1948. From 1955 to 1956, the Flushing Line platforms were extended to accommodate 11 cars. This platform extension was actually found throughout all the stations on the line, except for Queensboro Plaza. The reason why is because the IRT trains shared an island platform with the BMT trains. Nothing too major really happened for this station during the next few decades. In 1964, a new entrance opened at the corner of 7th Avenue and 42nd Street. Then, in the late 1970s, the Broadway line platforms had a minor overhaul, in which aspects like the appearance of the station and platform edges were improved. In 1983, Times Square 42nd Street was part of an experiment in which the MTA would install CCTV cameras around the station in hopes that it would help reduce the crime rate. It didn't, and they were eventually deactivated in 1985. Then, on August 1st, 1988, the passageway between 42nd Street Port Authority Bus Terminal and Times Square 42nd Street was retrofitted with fare control. Now, the late 20th century and the early 21st century consisted of renovations for the Times Square complex. In 1988, a $125 million renovation was announced. It was postponed in 1992, but then picked back up and started in 1994. It would be split into 3 phases. Phase 1 would renovate the 7th Avenue line platforms, which include a new mezzanine, stairs, and elevators. This would be completed in 2002. Phase 2 would renovate the platforms for the Broadway line, the Flushing line, and the 8th Avenue line at 42nd Street Port Authority Bus Terminal. Passageways would also be widened in order to ease congestion. Before I go on to Phase 3, I just want to mention that as early as the late 2000s, the MTA began construction of an extension of the Flushing line to 34th Street Hudson Yards. This would involve the demolition of the middle section of the lower level at 42nd Street Port Authority Bus Terminal, which was in the way. Some people believe that the IND built the lower level to specifically block the IRT from extending the Flushing line west. Anyways, on September 13, 2015, the extension opened, nullifying Times Square 42nd Street as the western terminus of the line. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about Phase 3 of the complex renovation. This phase was essentially the 42nd Street Shuttle project. In an effort to make the station ADA accessible, the MTA planned to change the layout of the shuttle platforms. The plans were finalized back in 2006, but the project was delayed due to funding issues. Then, in the 2015-2019 capital program, the MTA revised it to reflect the guidelines of the American with Disabilities Act of 1990. Construction began with Track 3, the middle track, being removed so it could allow for more space at the platform, which by the way would become an island platform. The 42nd Street Shuttle project was eventually completed in September of 2021, costing a grand total of $235.41 million. The original platforms were closed off and abandoned. The new platform was extended 360 feet to the east to allow for a connection to the 42nd Street Bryant Park Station and the 6th Avenue line. This station opened on December 15, 1940, and the line itself actually eased overcrowding on the 8th Avenue line, which had only opened just 8 years earlier. The 6th Avenue line was part of the IND, and it was meant to act as a subway replacement to the 6th Avenue elevated of the IRT. Speaking of which, there was an IRT station near Bryant Park Station, 5th Avenue on the Flushing line. The station was part of that westward extension I mentioned earlier in this video. A transfer connection between the two stations opened in 1971, long after the unification between the IRT and the IND. So today, you can actually walk from 5th Avenue Station all the way to 42nd Street Port Authority Bus Terminal, which is what I'm going to do. So, at 5th Avenue Station on the 7 train, there isn't really much to see, other than an island platform, with a crowd of people waiting for their train, which is usually the case with a 7 train. Walk up some stairs and you eventually get to the mezzanine, where you'll find this corridor, which takes you to the mezzanine for 42nd Street Bryant Park. The platform layout is a 4-track express stop, with F and M trains on the local tracks and B and D trains on the express tracks. Now, the stairs that take you to the fairly recent transfer hallway is actually at the northbound end of the northbound platform. Walk up, and you'll find yourself looking at some colorful decorations. Anyways, walk all the way to the end, and you'll suddenly find yourself at the 42nd Street Shuttle platforms. Now, since this platform was actually extended east, that means that what I am walking through right now was once the actual tunnel portion of the shuttle. The steel columns for the tunnel are still in place, spanning the entire platform. Now, of course, the shuttle originally started out having 4 tracks. Well, you can actually walk on the alignment of where tracks 2 and 3 used to be by simply just walking along the platform. In fact, to help you out, they even put fake rails into the floor to mark where the tracks would have been at. Now, if you watched part 6 of Secrets of the New York City Subway, then you will remember that I already covered some secrets here at Times Square 42nd Street. I will also list them in this video too. First off, you can actually see the right-of-way of track 1 continuing under the floor itself, a clear sign that it used to go further. Then, I mentioned in that video that you can actually see one of the original platforms of the shuttle in the tunnel just beyond the new platform. Afterwards, I talked about the secret door with a sign saying Knickerbocker Hotel, which was the secret entrance to the hotel that I mentioned earlier in this video. Finally, this new entrance to the station, which is actually the newest entrance opened in the New York City subway system. Now you may notice that the open space to look out onto the 7th Avenue line is now covered up, along with the rest of the original platforms. Before the 42nd Street Shuttle project, you used to go on this walkway as an interchange between the 3 platforms. And along there, you could watch as 1, 2, and 3 trains whizzed by. Now in part 4 of Secrets, I mentioned that you could actually spot the right-of-ways before the tracks running under 42nd Street would have merged onto the 7th Avenue line to head north along, well, 7th Avenue. So, these empty right-of-ways give a clue to the route of the original IRT subway line. Then, walking out of the shuttle platforms, you can see a cool art piece called the Lichtenstein mural, another secret that I mentioned in part 4. Now, the passageways to the Broadway line, the 7th Avenue line, and the Flushing line are clearly marked. But what I want to show you is that long journey to the 8th Avenue line platforms at Port Authority Bus Terminal Station. First, you walk through this hallway and down these steps. Then, you walk past the many stairways that take you to the 7 train. Then, you walk through this super long corridor that just tires you out, and it doesn't help that there's an incline you have to walk up. Then you just keep walking and walking and walking until you finally make it to the mezzanine of the 42nd Street Port Authority Bus Terminal Station. The platforms here are a 4-track express station. You may also notice that they are staggered. Some people think that the reason why the IND constructed the southbound platform offset from the northbound platform was so that it had an easy connection to the lower level platform by being located right above it. Remember, a likely explanation for why the lower level was constructed was to block the IRT's Flushing line from extending west. Oh, and speaking of the lower level, you can see this yellow hatch, which leads down to the abandoned platform. You can also see the track that heads down to the lower level as you're on the downtown 8th Avenue line train just before 42nd Street Port Authority Bus Terminal Station. So that finally concludes this video on the Times Square complex and its neighboring stations. Now that I think about it, this might be the only instance in the New York City subway system in which you can freely switch between IRT, BMT, and IND platforms in just one station complex, without having to take a single train. But anyways, if you did enjoy this video, then consider liking it and subscribing to my channel. I'll see you next time.